Chapter 1. A town with no name. The road stretched endlessly before Jacob, a thin, cracked ribbon of asphalt leading into an expanse of fog. His GPS had stopped working miles ago, and the last sign he had seen was rusted beyond recognition. No population count, no state marker, just a lonely road leading to a town that shouldn't exist. As he drove past the first cluster of dilapidated buildings, an unsettling stillness settled over him. There were no cars, no people, no signs of life. Yet, the town wasn't abandoned. Windows stood intact, lights flickered behind drawn curtains, and shop signs swayed gently in the wind. It was as if someone or something was here, but didn't want to be seen. Jacob parked his car on the side of the street, stepping out onto the cracked pavement. A faint hum filled the air, low and rhythmic, like a heartbeat hidden beneath the town's surface. He walked forward cautiously, glancing at the store's signs. None of them had names, just blank wooden boards where letters should have been. Even the newspaper in a nearby stand bore no headlines, just blank pages shifting in the breeze. His pulse quickened. "Hello?" he called out, but the sound of his own voice was muffled, as if the air itself swallowed it. A shadow flickered in the corner of his vision. He turned sharply, but there was nothing there. Just a row of buildings standing silent and still. A cold chill ran down his spine. Something was wrong with this town. He turned back toward his car, but his breath caught in his throat. It wasn't there. The entire street behind him had changed. Buildings that weren't there before now loomed in the mist, while the road had twisted into an unfamiliar layout. He was no longer just visiting this town. He was trapped in it. Chapter 2. The Silent Streets. Jacob walked forward, his footsteps muffled against the cracked pavement. The silence of the town was unnatural. There were no birds, no rustling leaves, no distant hum of life. Just his own shallow breathing and the sound of his boots echoing against the empty streets. The buildings that lined the road stood eerily still. The windows reflected nothing but shadows, as if they were painted black. Doors remained shut, yet he felt watched, as though something lingered just beyond his vision, waiting. The more he walked, the more distorted the streets became, twisting and shifting when he wasn't looking. Alleys that hadn't been there before stretched into darkness, while familiar landmarks disappeared the moment he turned away. A gust of wind swept through, but it carried no relief. Instead, it brought a whisper, not a voice, just a soft, fragmented sound, like breath against the back of his neck. Jacob spun around, his pulse hammering, but there was nothing behind him. His stomach tightened. The buildings were closer now, pressing inward, suffocating. He glanced back the way he came, but the street was no longer the same. The road he had walked just moments ago had vanished, replaced by a narrowing corridor of abandoned shops, their signs swinging eerily despite the stillness of the air. Then he saw it. A figure stood at the far end of the street, barely visible through the shifting mist. It was motionless, featureless, yet unmistakably watching him. Its presence sent a chill down Jacob's spine. He took a step forward. The figure took a step closer. Chapter 3. The Door That Shouldn't Be There. Jacob's breathing was unsteady as he backed away from the figure in the mist. He turned a corner quickly, his heart pounding, only to find himself in yet another unfamiliar street. The town was shifting, rearranging itself like a living maze. He needed to get out. Now. As he scanned his surroundings, something caught his eye. A door where there shouldn't have been one. It was embedded into the brick wall of an alleyway, standing tall and unnaturally clean compared to the decayed buildings around it. There was no handle, no keyhole, just a black surface that seemed to drink in the dim light. The whispers returned. Jacob's body tensed. The whispers came from beyond the door, slipping through its edges like tendrils of mist. They weren't spoken aloud. They were inside his head, pushing, pulling, calling him forward. His feet moved of their own accord, drawn to the door like a moth to a flame. His fingers trembled as he reached out. The moment his palm pressed against the surface, the entire town seemed to shudder. The lights in the windows flickered violently, the air became thick with static, and the ground beneath him vibrated. The whispers grew frantic, overlapping, clawing at his mind with words he couldn't understand. Then the door swung open. The space beyond was not an alley nor another street. It was an abyss, an endless void where no light could penetrate. The whispers became screams, and something inside was waiting for him. Chapter 4. The Whispering Walls. Jacob stumbled back as the door shut behind him with a deafening slam. He was no longer in the alleyway. Instead, he found himself standing in a dimly lit corridor, the walls impossibly narrow, pressing inward like a suffocating embrace. The air was thick, heavy with the scent of mildew and something metallic, something like blood. The whispers had not stopped. They slithered through the walls, not just around him, but inside them, embedded deep within the cracked, peeling paint. They whispered secrets in voices not meant for human ears, distorted, fragmented murmurs of things forgotten, things that should never have been spoken. Jakku placed his palm against the wall, and immediately his breath hitched. The surface pulsed beneath his fingers, warm and alive, like flesh stretched too thin over brittle bone. He yanked his hand away, heart hammering in his chest. Then the walls shifted. The whispers grew louder, rising in pitch, overlapping one another like 1,000 unseen mouths gasping for air. The corridor elongated, stretching impossibly far, the dim light flickering erratically. The walls trembled, their surfaces bulging outward, as if something inside was pushing against them, trying to break free. A long, jagged crack split the wall beside him, and from within, a shadowy hand emerged. Thin, twisted fingers clawing at the air. Jacob choked back a cry and stumbled away, only to see more cracks forming around him, more hands reaching, writhing, desperate to escape. The walls were not just whispering, they were screaming. Jacob turned and ran, his feet pounding against the unstable floor as the corridor twisted and warped around him. The walls convulsed, shuddering violently, faces pressing against their surface. Faces contorted in agony, their hollow eyes locking onto him as he passed. He reached a door at the far end, its wood rotting, its handle rusted. He didn't think, he just lunged for it, wrenching it open. The moment he stepped through, the whispers stopped. The silence was worse. Chapter 5: Shadows in the Fog. Jacob stepped into the thick, swirling mist, his vision narrowing to only a few feet ahead. The silence was oppressive, as if the air itself had absorbed all sound. The fog was denser than before, curling around him like living tendrils, its cold grip making his breath come in shallow gasps. Every step felt uncertain, the pavement beneath his feet seeming to shift, elongate, distort. Then came the movement. A shadow flickered in the mist, just on the edge of his vision. It was quick, disappearing the moment he turned his head. Another one darted behind him. He spun, his heart hammering. He wasn't alone. The figures weren't solid. They were silhouettes, shifting, gliding just out of reach. Some were tall and slender, others hunched and crawling. They moved with an unnatural fluidity, whispering sounds that weren't words but sensations. Cold fingers at the back of his neck, a phantom breath against his ear, the distant echo of a footstep that wasn't his. Jacob's pulse pounded. He had to move. He broke into a run, pushing blindly through the fog. The shadows moved with him, keeping pace, closing in. The mist thickened, turning the town into an endless, shapeless void. Every alley he turned down led to nowhere. Every street looped back onto itself. There was no way out. Then the whispers changed. They no longer came from behind him. They were ahead. Jacob skidded to a halt. The fog parted just enough to reveal a row of figures standing in the street, perfectly still, perfectly silent, their hollow eyes locked onto him. Then, all at once, they began to move. Chapter 6: The Unmarked Graves. Jacob's breath came in short, ragged gasps as he pressed forward through the mist. The figures had vanished as suddenly as they had appeared, swallowed whole by the shifting fog. He didn't know if they were following him or if the town had simply allowed him to continue. Either possibility was equally terrifying. Then he saw them. Rows upon rows of wooden crosses and broken headstones protruded from the earth like jagged teeth. The ground was uneven, riddled with depressions and disturbed soil, as though the graves had been freshly dug, but there were no names, no dates, no inscriptions. The headstones were blank, just like the town signs, as if the dead here had been erased from existence. A cold dread settled in Jacob's stomach. This place wasn't just forgotten. It had been deliberately buried in secrecy. A whisper drifted through the graveyard, so soft it was almost lost in the shifting air. He turned sharply, scanning the fog, but there was nothing, just the endless stretch of nameless graves. Then, the ground beneath him shifted. He staggered back as something crumbled beneath his feet. Looking down, he saw the disturbed dirt had given way to a hollow space, a partially uncovered grave, and inside it, a reflection. Jacob recoiled. It wasn't a body in the grave. It was himself. Panic surged through him as he stumbled backward, his own lifeless eyes staring up from the darkness of the pit. His own face, his own clothes, covered in dirt, motionless, buried. His mind reeled, his breath coming in sharp gasps as he tried to rationalize what he was seeing. But deep inside, he knew this wasn't a vision. The town wasn't trying to kill him. It had already succeeded. A rustling noise broke the silence. From the mist, figures began to emerge again. But this time, they weren't just shadows. They were coming from the graves. Chapter 7. The Eyes Behind the Curtain. Jacob staggered backward, his breath shallow as he watched the figures emerge from the graves. He turned and ran, pushing through the fog, his mind spinning. He didn't know where he was going, only that he had to move. The air grew thicker, pressing against him like unseen hands. Then the fog shifted, revealing a house at the end of the street. Unlike the other buildings in town, this one was intact, its wooden exterior untouched by decay. The windows were draped in heavy curtains, drawn tightly shut, as if hiding something inside. A faint flickering light shone through a small gap in the fabric, barely visible. A safe place, perhaps, or another trap. Jacob hesitated only for a moment before stepping onto the porch. The wooden boards groaned under his weight, the sound echoing unnaturally in the silence. He reached for the door handle, expecting resistance, but it turned easily. The door swung inward, revealing a dimly lit room lined with old furniture draped in sheets. The moment he stepped inside, the door slammed shut behind him. Jacques whirled around, his pulse hammering. He reached for the handle, but it wouldn't budge. He was locked in. A whisper brushed against his ear. He spun again, scanning the room. Nothing. But he could feel it. Something watching him. Slowly, his gaze drifted to the curtains. They were moving. Not fluttering, not caught in a draft. Moving, deliberately shifting, as though something behind them was pressing against the fabric. His throat tightened. He took a cautious step forward, his trembling fingers reaching for the edge of the curtain. The whispers grew louder. With a deep breath, Jacob pulled the curtain aside. A pair of hollow eyes stared back at him from the other side of the glass. The figure was pressed against the window, its face pale, expressionless. It had no mouth, no features, just those empty, soulless eyes locked onto his own. Then, slowly, impossibly more faces began appearing in the reflection, each one identical, multiplying behind the first, filling the window until there was nothing but a sea of watching eyes. Jacob stumbled back, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The whispers turned into a deafening chorus, pressing into his skull, making his vision swim. He shut his eyes, trying to block them out. Then, the whispering stopped. When he opened his eyes, the curtains were still. But the room was no longer empty. Chapter 8. The Vanishing Hour. Jacob stood frozen in the center of the dimly lit room, his breath shallow as the realization crept over him. The figures that had stared at him through the window were gone, but their presence lingered like a shadow on the walls. The air had changed. It was thick, heavy, pressing against his skin like invisible hands. Time itself seemed to warp, stretching and folding in on itself in ways that made his head spin. The clock on the wall ticked erratically, its hands moving forward and backward at random. 10:58, 12:13, 11:45. The numbers blurred together, twisting into symbols he didn't recognize. Then the clock stopped. 11:59. The whispers returned, low and insistent, weaving through the air like tendrils of fog. The wooden floor creaked beneath Jacob's feet, though he hadn't moved. Something was shifting around him, unseen but undeniably there. Then, the lights flickered. The room seemed to distort, the walls bending inward, stretching like they were breathing. A mirror in the corner of the room darkened, its surface rippling as if something on the other side was watching him. Jacob's pulse pounded in his ears. He turned toward the door, only to find that it was gone. Panic surged through him. The walls continued to close in, the space shrinking with each passing second. He stumbled back, but there was nowhere to go. The only thing left was the mirror. The reflection inside was not his own. A faceless figure stood where he should have been, its outline flickering, shifting between solid and transparent. The whispering grew urgent, frantic, swirling around him like a storm. The hands of the clock trembled. Then the final second ticked away. Midnight. The room collapsed into darkness. Jacob felt himself falling, the air rushing past him in a deafening roar, and just before everything went silent, just before the void swallowed him whole, the whispers coalesced into one final, chilling phrase. You were never supposed to leave. Chapter 9. The Unspoken Pact. Jacob's mind reeled as he tumbled through the abyss, weightless and lost in the void. There was no up, no down, just an endless expanse of darkness swallowing him whole. The whispers had returned, stronger now, weaving through his thoughts like vines tightening around his skull. Then, as suddenly as the fall had begun, it stopped. Jacob landed hard on solid ground, the impact knocking the breath from his lungs. He lay there, gasping, trying to process where he was. Slowly, he pushed himself up and looked around. The darkness had lifted, revealing a massive circular chamber. At the center stood a towering stone monolith, covered in the same symbols he had seen carved into the town's walls. The air was thick with a tangible energy, pressing against his skin, sending shivers down his spine. The whispers echoed through the chamber, but now they were clearer, forming words he could almost understand. It is time. A flickering light pulsed from the monolith, casting long, distorted shadows along the chamber walls. The symbols shimmered, moving like liquid beneath the stone surface. Jacob's eyes darted to the ground, where a circle had been drawn in dark, ancient lines. And within the circle there was something. Someone. A figure knelt in the center, motionless. Jacob hesitated, his breath catching. As he stepped closer, the figure lifted its head. It was him. His own face stared back at him, pale and lifeless, yet the eyes glowed with an unnatural light. The whispers intensified, filling the space between them. The pact must be honored. The figure in the circle lifted its hands, and Jacob saw it held an object, a dagger, identical to the one he had seen in the graveyard. The blade pulsed with an eerie glow, ancient and alive. The air crackled as the figure slowly extended it toward him. Choose, the whispers commanded. Jacob's pulse pounded. He didn't understand. Choose what? Then a memory flickered through his mind. Fragmented images of people before him standing where he was now. Each had made the choice. Each had taken the blade, and each had either escaped or become part of the town forever. The truth hit him like a thunderclap. The town did not let people leave. It traded them. One must stay so another may go. Jacob looked down at the dagger. He had two choices. Take it and complete the ritual, passing his fate to another lost soul, or refuse and remain trapped forever, becoming another shadow in the mist. The chamber trembled, the whispers growing frantic. "Choose," they demanded. Jacob reached for the blade. Chapter 10. Trapped in the unknown. Jacob's fingers hovered over the dagger, his entire body frozen with indecision. The whispers pressed against his mind like unseen hands, pushing him toward the inevitable. The chamber around him pulsed with unnatural energy, the stone monolith vibrating as if it were breathing, waiting for his choice. His mind raced. Was there truly a way out, or was this just another layer of the nightmare, another illusion crafted by the town to break him? The faces of the previous souls who had stood in this place flashed before him, nameless figures now lost in time, sacrificed to a fate worse than death. He clenched his jaw, forcing himself to breathe. If he took the dagger, if he made the sacrifice, someone else would take his place. Another unfortunate traveler, another lost soul. He could escape, but at what cost? The figure before him, the version of himself within the circle, tilted its head, as though hearing his thoughts. Its hollow eyes bore into him, filled with something ancient and knowing. Then, slowly, it extended the dagger further. Jacob's heartbeat pounded in his ears. He took a step back. The whispers surged into a cacophony of rage. The chamber shook violently, cracks splintering across the floor, tendrils of black mist seeping from the stone. The figure in the circle twitched, its form glitching like a distorted signal, flickering between his own face and something grotesque, something monstrous. Jacob turned and ran. The chamber stretched endlessly before him, the exit nowhere in sight. The symbols on the walls flared to life, casting eerie shadows that danced like specters reaching for him. The whispers became screams, voices from beyond clawing at him, cursing him, demanding his return. Then he saw it. A doorway, barely visible at the edge of the chamber, flickering in and out of existence like a dying ember. He pushed himself forward, lungs burning, feet barely touching the ground as he sprinted toward it. The figure behind him let out a piercing, inhuman shriek. Jacob didn't dare look back. With one final desperate leap, he threw himself through the doorway. Darkness swallowed him whole. When Jacob awoke, he was lying in the middle of an empty road. The cracked asphalt stretched before him, lined by an expanse of trees. The town was gone. No buildings, no fog, no whispers, only silence. His car sat idling a few feet away, the door ajar, the keys still in the ignition. The road sign ahead read a familiar name, yet somehow He knew he had never been here before. He was free, or so he thought. As he climbed into the driver's seat, a cold chill ran down his spine. In the rearview mirror, just beyond the trees, something watched him from the shadows. And then, ever so faintly, he heard the whisper, "It's not over